It was one of those rare moments that both reflected and molded the national character. Barely 4 years earlier, Americans had fought one another, North and South. In the Utah desert in 1869, they united the nation, East and West. The Transcontinental Railroad had become a reality. Perhaps only a nation of extraordinary energy and an unshakable belief in manifest destiny could have pulled it off. They had let nothing stand in their way, not the 1,800 miles between the Missouri River and Northern California, not the deserts and mountains, not the native tribes who had occupied the land for millennia. The cast of characters included people of the highest and lowest principles: businessmen, politicians, civil engineers, armies of laborers from Europe and Asia, and hundreds of pimps, prostitutes, and barkeeps. And when the railroad was done, ordinary Americans and immigrants would flood into the land. The railroad made the West and its place in the national imagination.
There were three main ways to get to California from the east before the railroad. The overland route typically struck out from some point along the mid-Missouri Valley, usually somewhere around Kansas City or St. Joseph, Missouri, went overland and across the Great Basin and finally across the Sierra Nevada.
Well, first of all, not a lot of people went to the West Coast at that point, and usually it was by the ocean. And that could be taking a sloop down to the Caribbean and walking across the Isthmus of Panama or across Nicaragua.
One was across Panama, and in 1855 a railroad was completed across Panama, all 48 miles of it, and literally it was the first transcontinental railroad in the Western Hemisphere.
The favorite method was the Shanks Mirror, that is, walking. And in fact, you know, we look at these covered wagon caravans, and most of those people, in fact, walked that entire distance.
Now, the interesting thing about this trip is that the timing of it was absolutely crucial. It had to be timed to coincide with spring rains and high grass on the Great Plains because you needed it for your livestock. But you also needed to get over the Sierra before the winter snows set in. Some parties didn't make it. The most famous example, of course, was the Donner Party.
The trek across the country overland got progressively better, more organized, better serviced by way stations and, in some cases, forts for Indian protection. But at the very minimum, it took months of hard labor. You were lucky to make 10 miles a day, and the human toll and the toll on animals, and especially children and older folks, was just horrific.
A lot of interest in going across the country, and there was a lot of interest in people wanting to do it faster and faster. The railroad promised to do that. The problem was finding a route, and the problem was financing it.
The idea of building a transcontinental railroad in the U.S. dates back almost to the very beginnings of railroading in this country. As far back as the 1830s, people were dreaming of a railroad to the West Coast. There were a lot of reasons why that didn't happen. But by the 1850s, it was beginning to look like it could become a practical reality.
Because when Asa Whitney was putting forth his proposals in 1844, 1845, and thereon until 1851, the whole issue of slavery politically was getting more and more heated, and basically stalemated the whole process of sending the Transcontinental Railroad across the United States.
By the early 1850s, after we'd suffered some economic panics in the 1840s, when our industrialization, our first industrial revolution, was well underway, the pressure to at least explore the idea of a Pacific Railroad had grown so great that in 1853, Congress appropriated about $17 million, about $75 million in today's money, for what was called the Pacific Railroad Survey.
In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln enacted the Pacific Rail Act. This was to route a train across to the Pacific Ocean and offering land grants to the railroad companies.
And when it was finally approved by Congress, there wasn't much money because it was in the middle of the Civil War and all the wealth of the country was going to fight the Civil War. Southerners wanted the railroad built one place, Northerners wanted the railroad built another place, and it was kind of a standoff, and nothing got done.